Silas swirled the dark red liquid in his crystal glass. The private club in the coastal town of Bridgewater, Maine, smelled of expensive cigars, wet wool, and old money. Garrick leaned across the green card table, a heavy smirk on his face as he watched the cards tumble. $1,000, Garrick said, tossing a heavy gold coin onto the felt. You marry the town spinster within 3 days, or you admit you lost the wager and hand over the keys to your harbor warehouse. Silas looked at the spinning coin. His hair was stark white, falling neatly over his forehead, and his skin was pale, almost like polished marble under the dim gas lamps. He did not need the money, but he despised losing to a man like Garrick. He stood up, grabbed his black wool coat, and walked out into the cold night rain without saying another word. The carriage drove through the dark, muddy streets of the coastal town. Rain hit the glass panels in a steady, rhythmic pattern that echoed inside the cab. Silas sat perfectly still in the shadows, his pale hands resting on his knees. He felt a dull ache behind his left eye, a common side effect of spending too many hours pretending to be a normal human in a room filled with heavy tobacco smoke and loud voices. The carriage turned a sharp corner and came to a stop in front of a narrow, cramped brick house near the docks. The neighborhood smelled of wet river stones, burning wood coal, and the sharp tang of boiled cabbage from the nearby tenements. Silas stepped down into the cold mud, his boots sinking slightly, though the freezing temperature did not bother him. His own skin was far colder than the northern wind. He walked up the short stone steps and knocked twice on the wooden door. A young maid with a smudge of soot on her apron opened it, her eyes growing wide as saucers. When she noticed the expensive carriage and the tall, white-haired gentleman standing on the porch, Silas walked past her into the small living room before she could even ask for his name. The parlor was tight and cramped, smelling heavily of old paper and damp wool fabric. The furniture was old and worn, with mismatched patches covering the arms of the chairs. A woman sat at a small wooden desk near the window, lit only by a single candle. She did not gasp or jump when he entered. She simply finished writing a line in her notebook, dried the wet ink with a piece of blotter paper, and then slowly turned her chair around. Maeve was 28 years old, an age where the local matchmakers had long since stopped visiting her door. She wore no makeup, and her dark hair was pulled back tightly into a neat bun that showed the sharp lines of her face. Her dress was a plain, cheap gray cotton that looked stiff enough to stand on its own. She had a strong, angular jawline and a small scar near her left eyebrow from a childhood accident. She looked at Silas with calm, steady eyes that did not waver under his gaze. "Sir," she said, her voice low and slightly rough from the cold room, "you are far from the wealthy side of Bridgewater. Did your driver take a wrong turn near the square, or are you simply lost in the fog?" Silas remained standing near the door, his tall frame making the low ceiling of the room feel even lower. "I am not lost," he said directly, his voice smooth and clear. "I am here to offer you a marriage proposal." The clock on the mantelpiece ticked loudly in the sudden silence that followed his words. Somewhere upstairs, a loose floorboard creaked under the weight of the settling house. Maeve looked at his expensive leather boots, trailed her gaze up his dark coat, and finally stopped at his pale face and unusual white hair. She did not look afraid of his strange appearance, only deeply skeptical. "You are either playing a cruel prank," she said, "or you have taken too much drink at the local tavern." "I am completely sober," Silas replied. He reached inside his heavy coat and pulled out a thick envelope of legal documents, setting them on the wooden desk right next to her ink bottle. "These are the marriage settlements, and they are incredibly generous. You will have everything you need for the rest of your life. I already know about your brother Leo and his gambling debts at the docks. He owes $4,000 to some very dangerous men, and that debt will be paid before the sun sets today. You will have a large house, a seasonal allowance, and total financial security. You will never have to worry about the winter cold again." Maeve did not touch the papers immediately. She looked at the white envelope, then looked back up at his face, studying the sharp lines of his features. "Why me?" she asked plainly. Silas tightened his jaw, knowing he could tell a lie about finding her charming, but he saw the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes. She lived a hard life where everything was about survival and numbers. She did not believe in romance or sudden affection from strangers. Does the reason matter to you? He asked, his tone turning flat. It matters if I have to see you across a dinner table for the next several decades, she replied, crossing her arms. I need a wife to satisfy the expectations of the people I deal with, Silas said, choosing his words carefully. I have no desire to marry a young girl who will cry when I stay out past midnight or force me to attend boring social gatherings. You are practical. You do not talk unnecessarily, and you understand the value of a clean ledger. You need money to save your brother from prison, and I need a companion who will leave me alone to manage my affairs. It is a fair trade between two people who need something. Maeve reached out her hand and picked up the envelope, her blunt fingernails catching the edge of the paper as she broke the wax seal. The chapel was freezing and smelled of old dust and cold stone. It sat on the edge of the town, far away from the grand churches where the wealthy families of Bridgewater held their weddings. The minister rushed through the vows, his breath turning to white mist in the cold air as he read from his small book. Maeve stood rigidly beside Silas, her hands tucked into her sleeves to keep them from shaking. She had not changed her gray cotton dress, which looked completely out of place against Silas's tailored black suit. When he reached out to slide the heavy gold band onto her finger, his touch was like ice against her skin. She blinked in surprise at the intense cold of his hand, but she did not pull away. I pronounce you husband and wife, the minister muttered, closing his book quickly and looking toward the small stove in the corner of the room. Silas dropped her hand immediately and turned toward the exit. My carriage is waiting outside, he said. The ride back to his estate was completely silent. The rain had turned into a thick sleet that rattled against the wooden roof like small stones. The interior of the carriage was warm, heated by a small coal warmer near their feet, but the space between them felt heavy and tight. Silas sat on the opposite seat, his long legs stretched out and his arms crossed over his chest as he watched her through the dim light. Maeve kept her eyes fixed on the window, watching the dark trees of the Maine woods blur past them. She did not look like a wealthy man's wife. She looked like a person preparing for a long, difficult journey. Silas felt a sudden, unexpected twist in his chest as he watched her quiet profile. He remembered Garrick's loud laughter at the club when he had accepted the challenge. She will turn your hair even whiter with her sharp tongue, Garrick had shouted to the room. It is a life sentence for your pride. Silas gripped his own arms tighter. He had married this woman to win a stupid game, and looking at her rigid posture, he began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. The carriage finally turned into a long, winding driveway lined with tall pine trees that blocked out the gray sky. At the end of the path stood a massive stone house that had been built over 100 years ago. It was a place of dark stone and tall windows, surrounded by a high iron fence. The air here felt different, colder, and more still than the town. The carriage stopped before the heavy front doors, and a tall butler dressed in a spotless black suit stepped down to open the carriage door. "Welcome back, sir," the butler said, his face completely expressionless as his eyes flicked toward Maeve's cheap dress and lack of luggage. "Thomas, this is my wife," Silas said as he stepped out onto the gravel path. "Show her to the rooms in the west wing. I will be in my study for the rest of the evening." Maeve stepped down from the carriage without waiting for Silas to help her. She looked up at the massive stone front of the house, her face showing no awe or fear. "It is very large," she noted, her voice steady. "It will take a lot of wood to keep this place warm in January." She did not wait for Silas to reply, turning instead to follow the butler through the heavy doors into the grand entrance hall. The inside of the house was a monument to wealth and silence. Polished marble floors stretched out under their feet, and large crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, though none of them were lit. The air smelled faintly of beeswax, old books, and something cold that reminded Maeve of a deep cave. Thomas led her up a wide staircase and down a long corridor lined with dark portraits of pale-faced men and women. "Your rooms are here, madam," Thomas said, opening a heavy oak door. "Dinner is served at 8 o'clock in the main dining room." Maeve nodded and stepped inside, closing the door behind her to face her new life alone. When 8 o'clock arrived, walked down to the dining room. Silas was already sitting at one end of a long mahogany table that could easily seat 20 people. She took her place at the very opposite end, the distance between them feeling absurdly wide. A servant placed 2 silver bowls of hot soup before them. The only sound in the room was the occasional clink of silver against porcelain and the steady crackle of the wood fire in the hearth. Maeve ate mechanically, using her spoon with deliberate care. She did not look at the expensive silk wallpaper or the silver candle holders. She simply ate what she needed. "Is the food to your taste?" Silas called out from his end of the table, his voice sounding unusually loud in the quiet room. Maeve paused, her spoon hovering over the bowl as she looked up at him. "It is adequate," she replied calmly. Silas let out a small, sharp breath that sounded like a laugh. "Adequate? My cook was trained in Europe. You find his work merely adequate?" "It is far too salty," she said, her voice completely even. "But it is hot, and I prefer hot food during a storm." She went back to her meal, leaving Silas to stare at her in silence. She was not intimidated by his wealth or his cold house. An hour after dinner had concluded, Silas walked down the quiet corridor toward the west wing. The house was dark, as he preferred to keep the lamps unlit when he was alone, his eyes adjusting easily to the shadows. He held a glass of dark amber liquid in his hand, the alcohol burning a warm path down his throat, though it did not truly affect him. He reached the door to Maeve's room and turned the brass handle without knocking. He expected to find her sleeping or perhaps sitting by the fire in tears, regretting her sudden choice to marry a stranger for money. Instead, he stopped short in the open doorway. Maeve was standing near the fireplace, struggling with her gray dress. She had sent the maids away, preferring to manage on her own, but the lower metal hooks of her gown were stuck. Her arms were twisted at an awkward, painful angle behind her back as her fingers worked blindly against the stiff fabric. Her dark hair was down, falling past her shoulders in thick waves that caught the orange glow of the fire. Silas noticed for the first time that her hair had hints of dark copper in it. She heard the click of the door and froze, looking over her shoulder with a red flush on her pale cheeks. "The servant," Silas began, his voice slightly deeper than usual. "I am not accustomed to having people touch my clothes," she snapped, dropping her arms to her sides. "I do not like strangers picking at my back. The metal hooks are old and rusted, and they are caught in the thread." Silas stood there for a long moment, watching the tension in her shoulders. He knew he should leave the room or call a maid to assist her, but instead he closed the door and walked toward her. His boots made no sound on the thick wool rug. "Turn around," he said softly. Maeve stiffened but did not move away. "I can manage it myself if you give me a moment," she said. "Turn around, Maeve," he repeated, his voice firm. She hesitated for a second, then slowly turned her back to him, facing the large mirror above the vanity table. Silas stepped up behind her, looking at their reflection in the glass. He was tall, white-haired, and tense, while she stood rigid, her chin lifted in a look of pure defiance. Silas reached out, his large, pale hands brushing against the rough cotton of her dress. Underneath the thin fabric, he could feel the intense heat of her human skin radiating against his cold fingers. Maeve let out a sharp, quick breath as his knuckles accidentally grazed her spine. Her skin goosebumped at his icy touch, but she did not shrink away from him. Silas worked the stubborn metal hooks with careful precision. He had lived for a very long time, but he found himself handling the cheap fabric with a strange amount of care, making sure not to tear the threads or pinch her skin. The room smelled of lavender soap and wood smoke. "I know about the wager," Maeve said quietly. Her voice did not shake, but it lacked the sharp, defensive edge it had carried all day. Silas's hands stopped completely on the very last hook. A cold sensation that had nothing to do with his nature passed through his chest. He stared at the reflection of her dark eyes in the glass. "Garrick was talking about it at the apothecary shop near the docks this morning," she continued, looking straight ahead. "He told the clerk that you bet $1,000 you could survive living with the town's most difficult woman." Silas could not find his breath for a moment, a sudden feeling of deep shame hitting him like a physical blow. "Maeve," he began, his voice rough. "Do not," she interrupted, turning around to face him. The gray dress fell loose around her shoulders, held up only by her hands gripping the front fabric. She looked up at him, her dark eyes clear and incredibly sharp. "Do not insult my intelligence with an apology. I do not care about your little game, Silas. I cared about my brother going to a cold cell, and I cared about freezing to death this winter because we could not afford coal. You bought a piece of property for your pride. she said, her voice dropping to a low whisper that filled the quiet room, and I sold myself for a warm room and a clear book of debts. We are both cold people who made a hard trade, so let us not pretend this is a sad story. Let us just get it over with. Silas looked down at her sharp jaw and her bare shoulders. The ancient, wealthy king felt something crack inside his cold chest. She was not a punishment at all. She was a clear mirror showing him his own ugliness. "Go to sleep, Maeve," he said quietly. He turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. The next morning arrived with a bright, cold sunlight that cut through the heavy green curtains of Silas's room. He woke with a heavy feeling in his chest, the memory of Maeve's bare shoulders and her quiet, tired words hitting him before he had even stood up. He washed his face with cold water and walked down to the breakfast room. He found her sitting in the exact same chair as the night before, wearing a plain gray day dress. She was using a silver knife to scrape the burnt edges off a piece of toast, the sound loud in the quiet room. "You did not sleep well," Silas noted, walking over to the side table to pour himself a cup of black coffee. The bitter, roasted smell filled the small space between them. "I slept perfectly fine," Maeve replied without looking up from her plate. "The mattress is filled with soft feathers, which is much better than the hard horsehair I am used to at home." Silas carried his white cup to the table and sat opposite her, watching her long fingers tear the dry toast into perfect little squares. "The invitations from the town will begin arriving this afternoon," Silas said, wanting to get straight to the point. The local families love nothing more than a fresh piece of gossip. A sudden marriage to a woman they considered an old maid will bring many eyes to our door. They will want to see what kind of woman captured the wealthiest man in the county. "A spinster," Maeve added, her voice calm and sharp. "A desperate woman from the docks. Do not walk on eggshells around me, Silas. I know what they say behind my back. They will expect us to make an appearance," Silas said, taking a sip of the hot coffee. "We are expected at Mrs. Fairfax's ball tonight in the town square. It is something we cannot avoid if we want the talk to stop." Maeve finally looked up from her plate, her dark eyes showing the faint gray shadows of a sleepless night. "You want to show off your winning bet to your friends," she said. "I want to stop them from whispering," Silas corrected her, his voice dropping low. "If we hide in this house, they will say I am ashamed of you. If we go together and show them a united front, the gossip will die from lack of interest within 2 weeks," Silas explained. Maeve studied his pale face for a long moment, looking for any sign of a trick or a lie. When she found none, she gave a single firm nod of her head. "Send a dressmaker to my room this morning," she said. "If I am to be marched out for the town to inspect, I refuse to do it in old gray cotton." Silas felt a strange sense of relief as he agreed. By 8 o'clock that evening, the black carriage pulled up to the large Fairfax estate in the center of town. The night air was freezing, biting at Silas's pale cheeks as he stepped out onto the cobblestones. He turned and offered his hand to his wife. Maeve stepped out into the light of the carriage lamps, and Silas felt his breath catch in his throat, a completely involuntary reaction that surprised him. She was not wearing the bright pinks or soft laces that the young girls in town always wore to these events. She had ordered the dressmaker to create a simple gown of deep purple velvet. It had no ruffles, no bows, and no extra decorations. The neckline cut straight across her collarbones, showing the sharp, strong lines of her jaw and shoulders. Her dark hair was coiled high on her head, held in place by a single silver pin. She looked severe, and she looked entirely dangerous. She placed her hand in his, and Silas noticed that her skin was warm this time, a sharp contrast to his own icy grip. The grand ballroom smelled of hot candle wax, expensive perfume, and the damp wool of coats left near the entrance. The noise inside was a loud roar of violins and hundreds of people talking at once. As Silas and Maeve stepped through the large double doors, the loud noise suddenly dropped. The room fractured into dozens of sharp whispers. Heads turned toward them, and several older women raised their fans to hide their moving mouths. Silas felt his familiar cold pride take over. He straightened his back and pulled Maeve's hand closer against his arm. "Keep your head up," Silas murmured, staring straight ahead at the crowd of staring faces. "My head is perfectly fine," Maeve whispered back, her voice as dry as old paper. "Worry about your own shoulders, sir." They walked slowly around the edge of the room, the crowd parting before them like water. Women stared openly at Maeve's bare, unadorned neck, which lacked the expensive diamonds or pearls that everyone else wore. Men smiled mockingly at Silas, raising their wine glasses in silent, insulting toasts. Silas's jaw ached from how hard he was clenching his teeth. "Well, look who has returned to us," a loud, thick voice called out from the center of the floor. Garrick stood directly in their path, blocking the way to the card room. He wore a bright yellow vest that looked too tight for his round stomach, and his eyes were watery and red from wine. He looked at Maeve with clear contempt in his eyes. "Garrick," Silas said, his voice dropping into a dangerously low growl that vibrated deep in his chest. "Step out of our way." "There is no need for anger, my friend," Garrick said with a wet laugh. "I only came to offer my best wishes on your sudden luck. Though I must say, I expected you to look a bit more tired. Taming an old maid from the docks must be very difficult work for a gentleman." Silas's right hand closed into a tight fist at his side. He shifted his weight, fully prepared to strike the man down right there on the polished floor, regardless of the scandal it would cause. Before Silas could move, Maeve took a step forward, moving in front of him. She did not shrink back or hide behind her husband's tall frame. She looked Garrick slowly up and down, her gaze staying for a long moment on the tight buttons of his yellow vest. "Mr. Garrick," she said, her rough voice carrying clearly over the sound of the violins. "I remember you now. My brother Leo mentioned your name quite often when he spoke of the docks. You are the gentleman who lost his entire fishing boat to a man who could barely see during a card game last winter. Are you not?" Maeve asked, her voice filled with polite curiosity. A sharp, collective gasp went through the crowd of people standing near them. Garrick's face turned a bright, angry red as he sputtered. "That is a lie, a foolish rumor," he shouted. "Is it?" Maeve asked, tilting her head slightly. "My apologies, then. I must have confused you with the other Mr. Garrick, the one who was turned away by the blacksmith's daughter because he smells constantly of old, onions and cheap ale." Someone in the back of the room let out a loud laugh. Garrick opened his mouth to speak, but he could find absolutely nothing to say. He looked at Silas, hoping for some kind of agreement between men, but Silas was merely staring at his wife with wide eyes. "If you will excuse us," Maeve continued, her tone dismissive as she turned away. "My husband needs a fresh drink, and you look like you need a better tailor." She pulled Silas past the silent man, the crowd opening a wide path for them. The midnight hours brought long, strange shadows across the floors of the stone estate. The carriage ride home had been filled with a heavy, electric silence that felt like the air before a summer storm. Silas did not go to his usual room upstairs. He walked directly into the large library, pulling off his heavy coat and throwing it onto a leather chair. The room smelled of old leather books, wood smoke, and polished wood. The fire in the large stone hearth had burned down to a few orange coals, but he did not call for Thomas to fix it. He walked to the corner cabinet, grabbed a bottle of strong rye liquid, and poured himself a full glass. He drank it down in one large swallow, letting the sharp burn clear away the lingering smell of the ballroom perfume and Garrick's sour breath. He had expected this woman to be a heavy weight around his neck, a quiet, angry ghost living in the corners of his home. He had not expected a person who could defeat the town's loudest bully with 3 short sentences and a cold look. A floorboard creaked near the door. Silas turned around to see Maeve standing there. She had already taken off the purple velvet dress and was back in her plain white nightgown, with an old wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her dark copper-streaked hair hung down her back in a long, tangled mass. She looked smaller without the heavy velvet dress, but her jaw was still set in that same stubborn line. "I cannot sleep," she said simply, her voice low. "Neither can I," Silas replied, leaning back against his large mahogany desk. He moved the liquid in his glass, listening to the small sound it made. "You made a very dangerous enemy tonight in town." "Garrick is a fool," she said flatly, walking into the room toward the small heat of the fire. "Fools are only dangerous if you treat them like they are clever. I refuse to do that." "You defended my name out there," Silas pointed, watching her. "I defended myself," she shot back, looking over her shoulder at him. The orange firelight caught the small crooked bend in her nose. "Do not get ahead of yourself, Silas. They were laughing at my family just as much as they were laughing at your wager. I am not going to be the joke for a town full of people who have nothing better to do with their days." Silas set his glass down on the wood with a sharp sound that echoed in the quiet room. "Why did you come down here tonight, Maeve?" She turned around to face him fully, pulling the wool shawl tighter around her thin frame until her knuckles turned white. "Because we have a signed contract," she said, her voice dropping all emotion, though her breath was coming faster now. "The papers are signed, and my brother's debts are paid. I saw the bank receipt this morning, but those papers mean nothing if this marriage is broken. An uncompleted marriage can be wiped away by a judge, and if Garrick looks for proof that we do not live as husband and wife, he will find it." Silas felt a sharp twist in his stomach as he listened to her cold, logical words. "You came down here to finish a business deal," he said, his voice flat. "I came down here to make sure I have a future," she replied, stepping away from the fireplace. Her calm face was finally beginning to break, showing the scared, tired woman underneath the hard exterior. "You will wake up one morning, Silas, and you will be tired of my sharp tongue. You will realize you are tied to a woman you never truly wanted. You will want a beautiful wife who smiles at your friends and does not cause trouble. And you will find a way to send me away," Maeve said, her voice starting to shake. "I cannot go back to that small house near the docks, Silas. I cannot go back to having no wood for the fire and no food in the cupboard." She was trembling now, not from the cold of the library, but from a deep, old fear that had lived in her bones for years. Silas crossed the room in 3 long steps, his movements too fast for a human eye to follow. He reached out and grabbed her by her shoulders, his cold hands gripping the rough wool of her shawl. "Stop talking," he commanded, his voice rough and uneven. Maeve flinched slightly, turning her face to the side as if she expected him to be angry or cruel. Silas did not yell at her. Instead, he leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, his white hair falling around her face. He felt her let out a quick gasp of air against his mouth. She smelled of simple lavender soap and the cold night wind. "I am a selfish, arrogant man," Silas whispered, his breath warm against her skin despite his cold nature. "I used you to win a stupid game at a club, but I am never going to send you away from this house." "You do not want me," she whispered back, looking down at the floor between them. "You could not even stay in the room with me last night." The deep hurt in her voice cut through his old defenses. He slid his hands down her arms, letting the heavy wool shawl fall to the floor with a soft sound. He moved his hands to her face, his long fingers tracing the sharp lines of her jawline, forcing her to look up into his eyes. "I did not touch you last night because I was deeply ashamed of myself," Silas said, the truth feeling heavy in his mouth. "I looked at you and realized I had no right to bring you here like a prize. I did not touch you because you looked at me like I was a monster," Silas added, "and you were completely right about me." Maeve stared up into his pale face, her dark eyes wide as she searched his features for any sign of a joke or a trap. She found nothing but raw honesty in his expression. She let out a long, shaky breath that roughed his white hair. "You are not a monster," she said softly. "You are just a man with far too money and very little sense." A small, surprised laugh came out of Silas's throat at her words. "There is the woman I married," he murmured. "I am being entirely serious, Silas," she said, though the tension was finally leaving her shoulders. "So am I," he replied. He did not give her a chance to move away this time. He leaned down and pressed his mouth against hers. It was not a gentle or practiced kiss. It was a sudden collision of heat and hunger that took them both by surprise. He tasted the faint salt of a tear she had refused to drop. He pulled her body close against his chest, feeling the fast, wild beating of her human heart against his own still ribs. For 1 second, Maeve stood completely still, frozen in shock at the intensity of his movement. Then, with a low sound in her throat, her hands came up. She did not push him away. Instead, she grabbed the fabric of his white shirt, pulling him closer against her, as she kissed him back with a fierce, starving energy of her own. All the years of being alone, all the cold winters, and all the anger she had held inside, seemed to come out in the pressure of her mouth against his. Silas backed her up against the large mahogany desk, several old books sliding off the edge and hitting the floor with heavy thuds that they did not even hear. He tangled his fingers in her thick dark hair, pulling the pins out until it fell completely free around them. It was messy, it was imperfect, and it was exactly what they both needed to burn away the coldness between them. The early morning light showed harsh gray angles across the scattered books on the library floor. Silas woke up with a stiff back, lying on the large rug near the desk. The heavy curtains had been left open, showing a quiet, foggy Maine morning outside the tall windows. He did not move a muscle because Maeve was still fast asleep, her head resting heavily against his chest. Her dark hair was scattered across his shoulder like a net, and one of her hands was still tightly gripping his crumpled shirt. The room smelled of old wood ash and the faint scent of lavender. Silas stared up at the high ceiling, listening to the steady, warm rhythm of her breathing against his neck. The cold armor he had worn for decades felt completely useless now. He had expected a wife to be a heavy chain around his feet, but instead, he had found someone who could break open the locked door of his life. He shifted his weight carefully so as not to wake her. Maeve stirred anyway, a small, rough sound catching in her throat as she blinked her eyes open against the gray light. She looked confused for a fraction of a second before the memory of the night hit her all at once. She sat up instantly, her back straight as a rod as she pulled the edges of her nightgown together, a deep red flush covering her cheeks. "Do not do that," Silas said, his voice thick with sleep, as he reached out and caught her wrist before she could move away. "Do not put the stone walls back up between us this morning." Maeve looked down at his hand on her wrist, her chest rising and falling quickly as she tried to find her words. She looked completely raw and entirely beautiful in the early light. "The servants will be waking up soon," she said, her voice small. "Thomas will come in to check the fire, and he will find us like this on the floor." "Let him find us," Silas replied, sitting up and rubbing the back of his neck. "It is my house, and you are my wife. Thomas can simply bring us some hot coffee." 2 hours later, they were sitting across from each other in the small breakfast room. The air between them was no longer a freezing vacuum, nor was it a perfect fairy tale. It was a simple, quiet peace. Maeve wore a dark green wool dress that fit her well, and she was carefully putting butter on a piece of fresh bread when Thomas entered the room, carrying a silver tray with the morning newspapers. The top paper featured a small, crude drawing of Silas holding a bag of money while a woman with wild hair chased a scared man. Silas stared at the ink drawing, his jaw hardening into a cold knot as he recognized Garrick's work. Maeve reached across the table and took the paper from the tray, looking at the drawing with a cool, critical eye. "They gave me a very large chin in this picture," she noted, her voice completely steady, "and it looks like Mr. Garrick is crying in the corner. How very accurate of them." Silas pushed his chair back from the table with a loud scrape. "I am going into town," he said. "I will settle this matter today." She looked at him with a dark, serious expression. "You cannot go and strike him, Silas," she said firmly. "If you use violence against him, you only prove that his words hurt you. You make us look like the desperate people he claims we are." "I am not going to strike him," Silas said, his knuckles turning white as he grabbed his coat. "I am going to pay him his money." The town club smelled of expensive tobacco and old wood when Silas walked through the front doors a short time later. The low murmur of conversation died down instantly as he entered the main card room, dozens of eyes snapping to his white hair and pale face. Garrick was sitting in a large leather chair near the fire, a glass of wine in his hand and a smug smile on his face. "Westford," Garrick called out, using Silas's old title. "Have you come to find a place to hide, or did your new wife chase you out of your own home already?" Silas walked straight to the table in front of him, pulled a heavy leather pouch from his coat, and dropped it onto the wood with a loud, heavy thud that sounded of pure gold. The room erupted into sudden whispers as the men stared at the bag of money. Garrick's smile faded slightly as he looked from the gold up to Silas's face. "You lost the bet?" he asked, surprise in his voice. "Are you breaking the marriage already?" "No," Silas said, leaning down until he was only inches away from the man's red face. "I remain entirely married to my wife. But I am handing over this gold because the entire premise of your wager was completely wrong from the start." Garrick moved back into his chair, looking confused. "Wrong? You bet you could survive living with her," he sputtered. "She is not a punishment or a chore," Silas said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent room. "She is the only intelligent, brave person in this entire miserable town. She has more courage, more wit, and more real worth than any man sitting in this room today, including you and including myself." Silas straightened up, looking at the shocked faces of the men around him. "I married a woman to win a foolish game, and it is the most shameful thing I have ever done in my long life," Silas stated clearly. "But I will not insult her by pretending she is a burden to me. I hand over this money because I did not lose anything. I won the only thing that matters." He turned his back on Garrick and walked out of the club into the fresh, cold air, his chest feeling lighter than it had in 50 years. The old ache behind his eyes was completely gone. When he returned to the large stone estate, he walked past his study and went straight upstairs to the west wing. He found Maeve sitting at a small desk with several large household books open before her, her fingers already stained with black ink. She stopped writing as he entered, the slight tension in her jaw showing her fear that he had ruined everything in town. Silas pulled up a simple wooden chair and sat down directly across from her, looking at her crooked nose and her steady eyes. "The business with the town is completely finished," Silas said softly. Maeve studied his face, reading the simple honesty there, and slowly her shoulders relaxed. She set her black pen down on the desk, the metal tip making a small click against the glass ink bottle. She reached across the open book, extending her warm hand toward him. Silas took it in his own cold grip, his thumb tracing the skin of her knuckles. "It is not a perfect story," she said with a small smile. "It is messy, and it is very strange." "It is exactly what we have," Silas replied, his heart feeling full as he looked at his wife. "Now, let us look at these books together. Your manager does not know how to count." Maeve looked out the tall window at the fog rolling across the dark pine trees of the Maine woods, her hand still warm inside Silas's cool grip. The large stone house around them was still silent, but it no longer felt like a cold tomb or a place of hiding. For the first time in her 28 years, she found herself looking toward the coming winter months without that old, sharp knot of fear in her stomach. She knew that their life together would not be filled with the sweet words or easy promises found in the romance books she had sometimes read as a girl. Their connection was built on something much harder and far more real than poetry. It was an arrangement born from necessity. But as she watched the gray mist move through the trees, she felt a quiet certainty that they would build something lasting from these broken pieces. Silas was a creature of the dark, a man with secrets colder than the northern wind, but he had looked into her own bitter corners and had not turned away. They were two sharp, difficult people who had managed to find a strange sort of comfort in each other's edges, a truce that was practical but deeply solid. As she turned her eyes back to the messy pages of the ledger book on the desk, she felt the steady warmth of his presence beside her, a quiet promise that whatever storms the future might bring to this isolated coast, they would face them across the same table, dividing the cold and sharing the heat until the seasons changed.